Hello, I'm Jerry Ford. Welcome to Jungle Jerry's Treehouse. Shall we finish this book here? This is The Sunset of the Sabertooth. Part 2. See what happens to Jack and Annie. They're in the Ice Age right now, so it's really, really cold and there's lots of dangerous animals. So let's see how they get themselves out of this mess. Chapter 5. Snow Tracks. Wow, what is this place? Said Jack. Maybe it's an art gallery, said Annie. I don't think so, said Jack. It's too hard to get to. He read about the cave paintings. These Ice Age beasts were painted 25,000 years ago. Cro-Magnons painted pictures of animals they hunted. They may have believed the paintings would give them power over the animals. Wow, look at this, said Annie. She pointed at a painting farther down the wall. It showed a figure with human arms and legs, reindeer antlers, and an owl face. It seemed to be holding a flute. Jack looked at the book again. He found a picture of the figure and read, "Cavemen may have been led by a sorcerer or master of the animals. He may have worn reindeer antlers so he could run like a deer, and an owl mask so he could see like an owl." See the paintings on the wall? What is it? Said Annie. The master of the animals, said Jack. He's a sorcerer. That's what? That's who we have to find. Why? Maybe he's a friend of Morgan's, said Annie. Jack nodded slowly. Maybe, he said. Let's go find him, said Annie. They went back through the tunnel into the first cave. We better put our lamps back, said Jack. He and Annie blew out their lamps. They placed them back by the fire. Sorry. Jack's backpack was on the floor next to the skins. He put the Ice Age book into it. How's Peanut? Said Annie. Jack looked into his pack. She's not here, he said. Oh no, cried Annie. She must have crawled out when we were looking at the paintings. Peanut, Jack called. Peanut, called Annie. Annie walked slowly around the cave, looking into the shadows. Jack peered around the fire and under each of the furry skins. Jack, come here, said Annie. She was standing near the entrance to the cave. The snow had stopped falling. In the snow were tiny tracks. You think Peanut went out into the snow? Chapter 6. Song on the Wind. Peanut's tracks, said Annie. We have to find her before she freezes. She wrapped her reindeer coat around her and headed across the snow. Jack pulled on his backpack and followed. The mouse's tracks led them between the fallen rocks and back onto the open plain. The wind blew harder. Snow swirled over the ground, covering the tiny footprints. I can't see them anymore, wailed Annie. She and Jack now stood in the middle of the plain. They stared at the wind-swept snow. The mouse's tracks had vanished. Yikes, whispered Annie. Staring up, Jack followed her gaze. On one of the cliffs was a tiger. A giant tiger with two long, sharp fangs. A saber-tooth, said Jack. I hope he doesn't see us, whispered Annie. Me too, Jack whispered back. We'd better head back to the treehouse. Jack and Annie stepped very softly across the snow. Then Jack glanced back at the cliff. The saber-tooth was gone. Oh man, he said. Where is he? Run to the trees, said Annie. He and Annie started running. They ran over the snowy plain, heading toward the tall, bare trees in the distance. Suddenly, Jack heard a crack. The ground caved in, and Jack went with it. Annie fell beside him. They crashed down onto a heap of branches, snow, and earth. They struggled to stand. Jack pushed his glasses into place. "You all right?" he asked Annie. "Yes," she said. They both looked up. They were in a deep hole. All Jack could see were gray clouds moving overhead. "This is a trap," Jack said. "The Cro-Magnons must have put branches over this hole. Then the snow hid the branches so we didn't see them." "There's no way out," said Annie. She was right. They were helpless. The pit was too deep to climb out of. "I feel like a trapped animal," Annie said. "Me too," said Jack. He heard a yowl in the distance. "The Sabertooth," whispered Annie. Jack pulled out the Ice Age book. He found a picture of the Sabertooth. He read, "The Sabertooth was the fiercest beast of the Ice Age. It attacked humans as well as woolly mammoths and other large animals." "Oh, brother," said Jack. "Listen." Annie grabbed him. "What?" Jack jumped. "I hear music." Jack listened, but all he heard was the wind. "You hear it?" said Annie. "No," said Jack. "Listen carefully." He closed his eyes. He listened very carefully. He heard the wind, but this time he heard another sound too. Strange, haunting music. "Ah!" cried Annie. Jack opened his eyes. Staring down at them was a figure wearing reindeer antlers and an owl mask. Would that be scary to see this guy looking down at you? "The sorcerer," whispered Jack. "Squeak." Scooby. Peanut peered down at them too. Where was he at? Chapter 7. The Sorcerer's Gift. The sorcerer didn't speak. He stared through the eye holes of the owl mask. "Help us, please," said Annie. The sorcerer threw a rope into the pit. Jack grabbed it. He wants to pull us up," said Annie. Jack looked up. The sorcerer was gone. "Where did he go?" Jack said. "Tug on the rope," said Annie. Jack tugged. The rope tightened. It began rising. "I'll go first," said Annie cheerfully. "Annie, this isn't a game," warned Jack. "Don't worry, I'll be careful." Jack gave her the rope. "Okay, but hold on tight," he said. Annie held the rope with both hands. She pushed her feet against the side of the pit. She rose into the air with the rope. She kept pressing against the side of the pit until she reached the top. Jack saw the sorcerer reappear and help Annie up. Then they moved out of sight. Jack was puzzled. The sorcerer had used both hands to help Annie, so who held the other end of the rope? "Wow," came Annie's voice. "What's going on?" Jack wondered. The sorcerer came back and threw the rope down again. Jack grabbed it, and the rope started to rise. Jack held on tight. He started up. His hands burned. His arms felt as if they were being pulled out of their sockets. But he kept his hold on the rope and his feet against the side of the pit. At the top, the sorcerer pulled Jack onto the snowy ground. "Thanks," said Jack, standing. The sorcerer was tall. He wore a long fur robe. Jack could see only his eyes through the owl mask. "Hey," Annie called. Jack turned. Annie was sitting on a woolly mammoth. Squeak. Peanut was sitting on the mammoth's head. The mammoth looked like a giant elephant with shaggy reddish hair and long curved tusks. The other end of the rope was around the mammoth's huge neck. "Lulu pulled us up," said Annie. "Lulu?" said Jack. "Don't you think she looks like a Lulu?" said Annie. "Oh, brother," said Jack. He walked up to the mammoth. Hey, mammoth starts with M," said Annie. "Maybe Lulu's the special thing." "I don't think so," Jack said. The great creature knelt down, just like a circus elephant. "Whoa," said Annie. She clutched the mammoth's ears to keep from falling off. The sorcerer helped Jack climb onto the mammoth. "Thanks," said Jack. Then the sorcerer reached into a pouch. He pulled out a smooth white bone and handed it to Jack. The bone was hollow. It had 4 holes along one side and 2 on the other. See, there's the mammoth. They're up on top. The sorcerer's handing them a bone. "Oh man, I think it's his flute," said Jack. "The book said they make flutes from mammoth bones." Jack tried to give the flute back to the sorcerer. "Nice," he said politely, but the sorcerer held up his hands. "He wants you to keep the mammoth bone," said Annie. "Mammoth bone," whispered Jack. "Hey, maybe this is the third thing." Jack looked at the sorcerer. "Do you know Morgan?" he asked. The sorcerer did not answer, but his eyes sparkled with kindness. He turned away from Jack and untied the mammoth's rope. Then he whispered in the ear of the giant woolly creature. When the mammoth stood up, Jack gripped Annie's coat to keep from falling off. He felt miles above the ground. He nestled behind Annie in the dip between the mammoth's head and the huge curved back. The mammoth took slow, plodding steps across the snow, then picked up speed. "Where are we going?" said Jack as they bumped up and down. "To the treehouse," said Annie. "How does he know where it is?" said Jack. "She just knows," said Annie. Jack looked back. See, Jack says, "How does he know where it is?" said Jack. Then, "She just knows," said Annie. Jack looked back. The sorcerer was standing in the snow, watching them. But at that moment, the clouds parted and the sun came out. Jack was blinded by sunlight on the snow. He squinted to see, but the sorcerer had vanished. Chapter 8, The Great Parade. The huge mammoth walked across the open plain. "Look," said Annie. She pointed to a herd of elk in the distance. They had great wide antlers. "There," said Jack, as a herd of reindeer came into view. They pranced gracefully across the snow. Then a woolly rhino joined them on the open plain. Then a bison. The elk, reindeer, rhino, and bison moved along with them at a distance. They seemed to be escorting Jack and Annie back to the treehouse. The snow sparkled with sunlight. "This is a great parade," Jack thought. "Fantastic." They were getting closer and closer to the grove of tall trees. "I told you," said Annie. "Lulu's taking us home." But just then the mammoth let out a cry. All the other animals bounded off. Peanut started to squeak. Jack looked around. Behind them, the Sabertooth was slinking across the sunlit snow. The woolly mammoth roared and plunged forward. Jack and Annie nearly fell off. Jack clutched Annie. She and Peanut clutched the mammoth's shaggy hair. The mammoth thundered wildly over the ground. "Ah!" Jack and Annie yelled. The mammoth charged to the grove of trees, but the tiger had circled around the trees. He stood between the tallest tree and the mammoth. They were trapped. The Sabertooth began moving slowly toward the mammoth. The woolly mammoth roared fiercely. But Jack knew a Sabertooth could kill any creature, including a mammoth. The huge tiger's head was down. His burning eyes were fixed on the mammoth. His long white fangs glinted in the sunlight. See the mammoth looking down at him? He's ready to fight. They had to fight for survival. Chapter 9, Master of the Animals. The Sabertooth crept forward. "Oh, excuse me." Jack stared in horror. "Play the flute," whispered Annie. "Is she nuts?" Jack thought. "Try," said Annie. Jack held the mammoth bone flute to his lips. He blew. The flute made a strange sound. The tiger froze. He glared at Jack. Jack's hands shook. The tiger growled. He took another step. The mammoth roared and stomped the ground. "Play it," said Annie. "Keep playing." Jack blew again. The Sabertooth froze again. Jack kept blowing until he ran out of breath. The tiger snarled. "He's still here," whispered Annie. "Keep it up." Jack closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. Then he blew as hard and as long as he could. He covered and uncovered the holes on the bone. The music sounded strange, as if it were coming from another world. "He's leaving," Annie whispered. Jack raised his eyes. The Sabertooth was slinking off toward the cliffs. "We did it," said Annie. Jack lowered the flute. He felt very tired. The mammoth waved her trunk happily. To the treehouse, Lulu, said Annie. The woolly mammoth snorted. Then she lumbered over to the tallest tree. From the back of the mammoth, Jack grabbed the rope ladder. He held it for Annie. She stroked the mammoth's giant ear. Bye, Lulu. Thank you, she said. Annie grabbed the rope ladder. Then she started up. Peanut climbed up too. After they disappeared into the treehouse, Jack climbed onto the ladder. He looked back at the woolly mammoth. Bye, girl, he said. Go home now and watch out for the Sabertooth. The mammoth walked away into the sunset. When Jack couldn't see her anymore, he started up the rope ladder. He pulled himself into the treehouse. Ta-da, said Annie. She handed the Pennsylvania book to Jack. Jack smiled. Now he was positive they had found the third M thing. Their mission was complete. Before we leave, we have to give our coats back, said Annie. Oh, right, said Jack. They took off their reindeer skin coats and dropped them to the ground. Brr, said Annie. I hope the Cro-Magnon people find them. Jack stared out the window. He wanted to take one last look at the prehistoric world. The sun was setting behind the hills. 4 people were crossing the snowy plain. It was the Cro-Magnon family. Hey, shouted Annie. Shh, said Jack. The Cro-Magnon stopped and peered in Annie and Jack's direction. We left your reindeer skins down there. Annie pointed to the ground. The tallest person stepped forward and raised a spear. Time to go, said Jack. He grabbed the Pennsylvania book. He found the picture of Frog Creek and pointed at it. I wish we could go home, he said. Goodbye, good luck. Oh, sorry. Annie called, waving out the window. The wind started to blow. The leaves began to shake. The wind blew harder, and the treehouse started to spin. It spun faster and faster. Then everything was still. Absolutely still. Chapter 10. This Age. Birds sang. The air was soft and warm. I hope they find their coats, said Annie. Me too, said Jack. He pushed his glasses into place. Squeak. Hey, you. How did you find the sorcerer? Annie asked Peanut. Squeak. It's a secret, huh? Said Annie. She turned to Jack. Where's the flute? He held up the mammoth bone. Then he placed it on the M carved into the floor, next to the mango from the rainforest, next to the moonstone from the time of the ninjas. Moonstone, mango, mammoth, bone, Annie said. We need just one more thing, one more M thing. Then Morgan will be free from her spell. Tomorrow, said Jack. Annie patted Peanut on the head. Bye, you, she said. She started down the rope ladder. Jack gathered his things. He paused and glanced at the mouse. She stared at him with big brown eyes. Thanks again for helping us, he said. Then he climbed down the rope ladder and jumped onto the ground. Jack and Annie ran through Frog Creek Woods onto their street. Their neighborhood looked rosy in the sunset. It's great to be back in this age, Jack thought. Warm and safe and almost home. I'm glad we don't have to go hunting for dinner, he said. Yeah, Mom and Dad already did that, said Annie, at the supermarket. I hope they trapped some spaghetti and some meatballs, said Jack. I hope they trapped a pizza, said Annie. Hurry, I'm starving, said Jack. They ran up their sidewalk and through their front door. We're home, shouted Annie. What's for dinner? Shouted Jack. Did I show you this? Holding up the flute. They got everything that they found so far on the M there, see? And then the next picture was a big plate of spaghetti and meatballs. Okay, that was the end of that one. $19 and 51 seconds. I don't think I've read this. If y'all aren't interested, then you can just stop here. But here's about the author. Mary Pope Osborne is the award-winning author of over 40 books for young people, including American Tall Tales, Favorite Greek Myths, the Spider Cane Mystery Books, and One World, Many Religions, and an Orbis Picture Honor Book. She recently completed 2 terms as president of the Authors Guild, the leading writers organization in the United States. She lives in New York City with her husband, Will, and their Norfolk Terrier, Bailey. They also have a cabin in Pennsylvania. Huh. I'll be darned. Pretty cool. There you go. All right. Well, thanks for sitting and listening to the story. We'll go to number 8, book 8. I don't know what the story is yet, but I'll be anxious to see what's going to be their next adventure. Should be their last one, I think. And then they can free Morgan from the spell. So, I'll see you on the next one.